There is a belief that almost everyone grows up with, that being kind will always make life better, that if you are patient enough, generous enough, understanding enough, people will naturally appreciate you, respect you, value you. It is a beautiful idea, but it is not always true, because there is another side to kindness that few people ever talk about, a side that doesn't reveal itself overnight. It appears slowly, so slowly that most people never notice it happening. One favor becomes another. One sacrifice becomes a habit. One apology becomes a personality. Until one day, you look at your life and realize something unsettling. You have spent so much time trying not to disappoint other people that you no longer know what you truly want. The strange part is that no one forced you to live this way. Most of the time, the prison was built quietly. One decision at a time, one yes at a time, hidden behind words that sounded generous. I don't mind. It's okay. Whatever you prefer. I'll be fine. For a while, those words feel harmless, even noble. But over the years, they begin to cost something. Not money, not success. Something far more difficult to replace. Your voice, your boundaries, your sense of self. Psychology has long suggested that human beings are deeply wired for connection. We want to belong, to be accepted, to avoid rejection. There is nothing wrong with that. It is part of being human. The problem begins when acceptance becomes more important than authenticity, when keeping the peace becomes more important than speaking the truth, when being liked becomes more important than being honest, because little by little a person can become so skilled at meeting everyone else's expectations that they quietly abandon their own. And perhaps that is the hidden tragedy of always being nice. Not that kindness is a weakness, but that kindness without boundaries slowly becomes self-neglect. The world often celebrates those who give endlessly, but it rarely asks what they had to give up in order to keep giving, and perhaps that is where our story truly begins. Long before people learn how to protect themselves, they first learn how to be liked. It begins so early that few of us ever question it. As children, we are praised for sharing, praised for obeying, praised for being polite, praised for putting other people first. Every smile from an adult becomes a quiet lesson. Every compliment becomes a reward. Every good job teaches us what kind of person the world seems to value. There is nothing inherently wrong with these lessons. Kindness is one of the qualities that allows people to trust one another. Without kindness, families fall apart. Friendships become fragile. Communities disappear. The problem is not that we are taught to be kind. The problem is that kindness is often taught without wisdom. Children are rarely taught the difference between being generous and giving away more than they can afford. Not money, but time, energy, peace of mind, even their sense of identity. No one explains that saying yes can become a habit, or that apologizing too often can slowly become a way of asking permission to exist. Most people never notice the moment this happens, because it doesn't arrive with pain, it arrives with praise. People begin describing them in ways that sound like compliments. She's so easy to talk to. He's always available. You can always count on them. At first, those words feel warm, comforting. They create a quiet sense of purpose. Being needed feels meaningful. Being dependable feels rewarding. After all, what could possibly be wrong with making life easier for the people you care about? But every strength carries a shadow. A knife can prepare a meal. The same knife can cause harm. Water gives life. Yet too much of it can destroy entire cities. Kindness follows the same principle. What makes it beautiful can also make it dangerous. Because kindness without limits does not remain kindness forever. Eventually, it becomes expectation. People stop being grateful for what you give. They begin assuming it will always be there. Not because they are cruel, but because human beings adapt remarkably quickly to whatever becomes normal. Psychologists sometimes refer to this tendency as adaptation, What once felt extraordinary eventually becomes ordinary. The first favor receives heartfelt gratitude. The 100th favor barely receives a thank you, not because your kindness became less valuable, but because people quietly adjusted to receiving it. This is one of the quietest transformations in human relationships. The more consistently someone ignores their own needs, the more invisible those needs become, not only to other people, but to themselves. And that is where the hidden cost begins, because a person who spends years listening to everyone else's voice may eventually struggle to recognize their own. The tragedy is not that they lose their kindness. The tragedy is that they slowly lose the person who was trying to be kind in the first place. Perhaps this is why so many people wake up one day feeling exhausted, without understanding why. Nothing dramatic happened. No single betrayal. No catastrophic event. Only thousands of tiny moments where they quietly chose everyone else before themselves. Like a shoreline disappearing beneath the tide, the change was almost impossible to notice while it was happening. Until one day, they looked within and realized they could no longer remember where they ended, and everyone else began. If you ask someone why they always put other people first, their answer will usually sound simple. I just like helping. I don't want anyone to feel bad. I've always been this way. And sometimes those answers are true, but human behavior is rarely driven by only one reason. Beneath almost every habit, there is a deeper emotional need. Kindness is no exception. For many people, the need to please others does not begin with generosity. It begins with fear, not always obvious fear, not the kind that makes your heart race, but a quieter fear. The fear of disappointing someone, the fear of being misunderstood, the fear of creating conflict, the fear that saying no might change the way people see you. It is remarkable how much of human behavior is shaped by rejection. Long before people fear failure, many learn to fear disapproval, a disappointed look, a change in someone's tone, a moment of silence after expressing an opinion. Small experiences like these often leave a deeper impression than we realize, especially during childhood. Children are incredibly observant. They quickly learn which behaviors receive affection and which behaviors create distance. Some grow up believing love is freely given. Others quietly begin believing it must be earned by being helpful, earned by being obedient, earned by never becoming a burden. Over time, this belief becomes almost invisible. It no longer feels like a belief. It simply feels like reality. Without realizing it, they begin measuring their worth by how useful they are to other people. If someone is happy, they feel successful. If someone is upset, they immediately wonder what they did wrong, even when the disappointment had nothing to do with them. This is one of the hidden burdens carried by people who constantly seek harmony. They assume responsibility for emotions that were never theirs to carry. Like someone trying to hold an umbrella over everyone during a storm, they become exhausted, not because the rain is endless, but because the task was never possible. The truth is, every human being is responsible for their own emotional world. You can offer kindness, you can offer understanding, you can offer support, but you cannot permanently protect another person from disappointment, nor should you. Disappointment is not always a sign that something has gone wrong. Sometimes it is simply the natural consequence of two people having different needs. Yet people who spend their lives avoiding conflict often struggle to accept this. To them, disagreement feels dangerous, not because it actually is, but because somewhere in the past their mind quietly learned to associate conflict with the possibility of losing love. And so they become experts at predicting what everyone else needs, experts at reading facial expressions, experts at adjusting their personality depending on the room they enter. From the outside, this ability can seem like emotional intelligence. Sometimes it is, but sometimes it is something much sadder. It is survival. A strategy developed so early that it eventually feels like personality. Perhaps this is why so many kind people reach adulthood feeling strangely invisible. The world knows the version of them that is agreeable, reliable, easy to be around. But very few people ever meet the person beneath all those adaptations,
Because after years of becoming who everyone else needed, they quietly forgot to ask themselves a simple question: who am I, when there is no one left to please?
There is a quiet moment that changes a person's life, not because something dramatic happens, but because something quietly disappears: the ability to choose. Most people imagine that losing freedom happens all at once, through control, through manipulation, through force. But in reality, freedom often disappears in much smaller ways. It disappears every time someone says yes, when their heart was quietly asking for no. At first, the difference feels insignificant. You agree to stay a little longer, you accept another responsibility, you answer another late-night phone call, you cancel your own plans, just this once. At least that is what you tell yourself. But habits are not built through extraordinary moments. They are built through ordinary ones. And what is repeated often enough eventually stops feeling like a decision. It simply becomes who you are. This is how many people slowly lose contact with themselves, not through one great sacrifice, but through hundreds of invisible compromises. Each one seems too small to matter, yet together they quietly reshape an entire life. Psychologists often speak about identity as something we discover, but identity is also something we practice. Every choice teaches the mind who we believe ourselves to be. When someone repeatedly ignores their own needs, their mind begins learning an unexpected lesson. My needs must not be very important. No one says those words out loud. They are learned through repetition. The same way a path appears in a forest. No single footstep creates it, but enough footsteps. And eventually the ground remembers. The human mind works in much the same way. Every time you silence your own opinion, it becomes slightly easier to silence it again. Every time you dismiss your own exhaustion, your body learns that rest can wait. Every time you place someone else's happiness above your own, your heart quietly learns where it belongs, at the bottom of the list. Perhaps this is why people who are always kind often struggle with a question they never expected. What do I actually want? It sounds like such a simple question, yet for someone who has spent years organizing their life around everyone else's expectations, the answer can feel strangely out of reach, not because they have no desires, but because those desires have been interrupted for so long that they no longer speak loudly. Imagine living beside a river your entire life. At first you hear the water every day, but after enough years your mind stops noticing it. Not because the river disappeared, but because it became familiar. Your own voice can disappear in exactly the same way. It never truly leaves. It simply becomes buried beneath louder voices, the opinions of others, their needs, their approval, their disappointment. And after enough time, people begin confusing obedience with kindness. They believe sacrificing themselves is proof of love, that exhaustion is proof of generosity, that saying yes is proof of a good heart. But a choice that cannot be refused is no longer a choice. And kindness that cannot say no is no longer freely given. It becomes obligation. Perhaps this is why so many people wake up one morning feeling as though they have become strangers to themselves, not because they intentionally lost who they were, but because little by little, they stopped asking themselves a question that every human being deserves to answer. What kind of life feels true to me? And without realizing it, they spent years becoming everything the world asked for, while quietly forgetting the person they had always meant to become. One of the greatest misconceptions about kind people is that they are always calm, always patient, always understanding. But emotions do not disappear simply because they are ignored. They only change where they live. Some are expressed through words, others remain hidden beneath silence. A person who spends years protecting everyone else's feelings often becomes unfamiliar with protecting their own. Not because they have no emotions, but because somewhere along the way they learned that certain emotions were unacceptable. Frustration, disappointment, anger, even sadness. Instead of asking, "What am I feeling?" they quietly begin asking, "What am I allowed to feel?" It is a subtle difference, yet it changes everything. Because emotions that are constantly denied do not simply vanish. They wait. Like letters that were never opened, they quietly accumulate, day after day, year after year, until the weight becomes impossible to ignore. Psychologists have long understood that suppressing emotion is not the same as resolving it. Ignoring a wound does not help it heal. It only hides the pain beneath the surface. The human mind works in remarkably similar ways. Every emotion carries information. Anger often tells us that a boundary has been crossed. Sadness reminds us that something meaningful has been lost. Fear tries to protect us from danger. Even disappointment has a purpose. It tells us that reality did not meet our expectations. None of these emotions are enemies. They are messengers. The problem begins when a person spends so much of their life trying to appear good that they stop listening to the messages altogether. Instead, they smile, they reassure, they apologize, they convince themselves that everything is fine, even when something deep inside quietly whispers, "It isn't." This is where resentment is born, not in a single dramatic moment, but through repetition. Each time someone remains silent instead of speaking honestly, each time they accept treatment that quietly hurts them, each time they forgive, before allowing themselves to acknowledge the pain. Resentment grows, not like fire, but like rust, slowly, almost invisibly. It does not destroy a person overnight. It weakens them little by little until even simple acts of kindness begin to feel heavy. This is why some of the kindest people unexpectedly become emotionally distant, not because they stopped caring, but because caring became exhausting. There is only so much emotional weight one person can carry before the heart begins protecting itself. Sometimes that protection looks like withdrawal, sometimes it looks like numbness, sometimes it appears as quiet irritation toward the very people they once loved helping, and that confusion often creates guilt. Why am I becoming this person? What happened to me? The answer is usually much simpler than they imagine. Nothing is wrong with their kindness. They have simply been pouring from a cup that has not been filled in a very long time. No river can continue flowing if its source slowly dries up. No tree can keep giving fruit if its roots are never nourished. Human beings are no different. Compassion is renewable, but only when the person offering it is also receiving care. Perhaps this is the lesson that many kind people learn far too late, that constantly ignoring your own emotions does not make you more loving. It only makes your suffering quieter. And suffering that remains silent often lasts the longest. There is something uncomfortable about human nature, not because people are cruel, but because people adapt, far more quickly than we realize. Think about the first time someone does something generous for you. You notice it immediately. You feel grateful. You remember it. Perhaps you even tell other people about it. But imagine that same kindness happening every single day. At some point, something changes. Not because your appreciation disappears, but because your mind quietly begins treating it as normal. This is one of the oldest tendencies in human psychology. What is repeated often enough stops feeling like a gift. It begins feeling expected. The sun rises every morning, yet few people stop to admire it. Clean water flows from a tap, yet most people only think about it when it is gone. Our minds are designed to notice change, not consistency. Kindness follows the same pattern. The more consistently someone sacrifices themselves, the less visible those sacrifices become. Not because others have stopped caring, but because the sacrifices have become part of the background. Like the steady ticking of a clock, they slowly disappear from awareness. This is why many people who are always available eventually begin feeling invisible. They answer every phone call, they solve every problem. They remember everyone's birthday. They show up whenever someone is in need. Yet when they quietly need support themselves, the silence feels almost shocking. Not always because people are selfish,
Sometimes because no one realized they were struggling at all. After years of seeing someone smile, it becomes difficult to imagine that they are hurting. After years of hearing, "I'm fine," people eventually believe it. This creates one of the saddest paradoxes in human relationships. The more capable you appear, the less people think you need help. The more dependable you become, the less people think to ask how you are doing. Strength often hides suffering, not because strong people never break, but because everyone assumes they never will. And when this continues for years, a quiet resentment begins to grow. Not necessarily toward other people, but toward life itself. A person begins wondering, why am I always the one who understands? Why am I always the one who gives? Why does no one notice when I am tired? These questions do not come from selfishness. They come from exhaustion. There is an important difference. Selfishness asks, "What can I take?" Exhaustion quietly asks, "Will anyone notice that I have nothing left to give?" Perhaps this is why people who have been too nice for many years often experience a painful awakening. They discover that some relationships were never built on mutual care. They were built on predictable availability. As long as they kept giving, everything felt peaceful. But the moment they needed something in return, the relationship suddenly felt different. Not because the other person had changed overnight, but because the balance had never truly existed. Imagine a bridge supported by only one pillar. For years it appears strong. People walk across it every day. No one questions its stability. Until one day the pillar begins to crack. Only then does everyone realize the bridge was never being carried by both sides. It had been resting on one person all along. Healthy relationships are not measured by how much one person can endure. They are measured by whether both people are willing to carry the weight together. And perhaps that is one of the quietest lessons adulthood teaches. The people who truly value your kindness will also care what it costs you, because real love, real friendship, and real respect do not simply ask, "What have you done for me?" They also ask, "What has all this giving done to you?"
For many people, the hardest word in the world is not failure. It is not goodbye. It is not even forgive. It is a much smaller word. No. Such a simple word, only 2 letters. Yet for someone who has spent years protecting other people's comfort, it can feel impossibly heavy. Because saying no does not only reject a request, sometimes it challenges an identity. If a person has spent most of their life believing, "I am valuable because I am always there," then every boundary feels like a threat, not to the relationship, but to who they believe themselves to be. This is why guilt often appears long before confidence does. A person finally says no. The conversation ends peacefully. No one becomes angry, no one leaves, nothing terrible happens. And yet their mind refuses to relax. It searches for danger. Did I sound rude? Should I have explained more? What if they think I've changed? What if they stop liking me? The most exhausting arguments in life are often the ones that happen after the conversation is already over, inside our own minds. Psychologists sometimes describe this as a learned expectation. When the brain has spent years predicting rejection, it continues looking for rejection, even when none is there. Like someone who keeps carrying an umbrella hours after the rain has stopped, the habit outlives the storm. Perhaps this explains why healthy boundaries feel so uncomfortable in the beginning, not because boundaries are wrong, but because they are unfamiliar. Human beings often mistake familiarity for safety, even when what feels familiar has been quietly hurting them for years. A person can become so accustomed to self-sacrifice that peace itself begins to feel strange. Receiving help feels uncomfortable. Being cared for feels undeserved. Rest feels unproductive. And choosing themselves feels selfish. But selfishness and self-respect are not the same thing. A person who locks every door in their house is not rejecting the world. They are protecting what is valuable. A garden surrounded by a fence does not hate the outside. The fence simply allows what grows inside to survive.
Boundaries serve the same purpose. They are not walls built to keep love out. They are gates that allow love to enter without allowing everything else to follow. Perhaps that is why the healthiest people are not those who give the most. They are the ones who know when giving creates connection and when giving quietly becomes self-erasure. There comes a moment in adulthood when a person must choose which discomfort they are willing to live with: the temporary discomfort of disappointing someone else, or the lifelong discomfort of continuously disappointing themselves. Neither choice feels easy, but only one allows a person to remain whole, because every sincere no protects the possibility of a wholehearted yes. And a life built on genuine choices will always be more peaceful than a life built on silent obligation.
One of the quietest signs of emotional maturity is not learning who to love. It is learning how love should feel. Many people spend years asking themselves the wrong question. Who deserves my kindness? It sounds like wisdom. But there is another question that often matters even more. Who allows me to remain myself? There is a profound difference between being appreciated and being needed. A person can need your time, need your advice, need your patience, need your constant availability, and still never truly see you, because needing someone is not the same as knowing them. Real relationships ask for your presence, not your disappearance. This is something many people only realize after years of trying to earn love through usefulness. Eventually, they meet someone who thanks them before they apologize, someone who notices their silence before they explain it, someone who asks, "How are you doing?" and actually waits for the answer. At first, that kind of care can feel unfamiliar, even uncomfortable, because people who have spent years becoming everyone else's safe place often have no idea how to become safe enough to lean on someone else. Receiving can feel harder than giving, not because they are proud, but because giving has always felt like control. When you are the one helping, you know your role, you know what is expected, but allowing someone to care for you requires something much more frightening. Trust. Trust means accepting that your worth does not disappear the moment you stop being useful, that your presence alone can be enough. This is difficult for people whose value has always felt connected to what they provide. Imagine a tree standing in the middle of a forest. For years it stretches its branches outward, offering shade, shelter, a place for birds to rest. There is beauty in that. But imagine if the tree never received sunlight, never absorbed water, never allowed its roots to grow deeper. Eventually it would no longer matter how generous its branches were, because the tree itself would slowly begin to die. Human relationships follow a similar truth. The healthiest people are not only generous, they are also willing to be cared for, to be understood, to be seen, without feeling guilty for it. There is another misconception about love. Many people believe that love means constantly proving yourself, constantly earning your place, constantly showing your value. But genuine affection rarely works that way. The healthiest relationships do not ask you to perform. They invite you to arrive, without a mask, without rehearsed answers, without carefully measuring every word for fear of disappointing someone. You begin noticing something remarkable. You laugh more naturally. You explain yourself less. Silence no longer feels dangerous. You stop wondering whether every disagreement will end the relationship. Because real connection is strong enough to survive honesty. Perhaps that is one of the clearest signs that you have found emotionally healthy people. You do not leave every conversation wondering whether you were enough. You leave feeling that you were allowed to exist, exactly as you are. And maybe that is what all human beings have been searching for from the very beginning. Not people who ask us to become smaller, so they can feel more comfortable, but people whose presence quietly reminds us that we never needed to become smaller at all. There is a strange kind of peace that cannot be found in quieter cities, better jobs, or more understanding people. It appears somewhere else, somewhere far less visible. Within the quiet decision to stop walking away from yourself. Many people spend years believing that peace is something waiting for them in the future, after they become more successful, after they find the right relationship, after everyone finally understands them. But peace has never depended entirely on circumstances. Often it begins with a relationship, the one most people neglect, the relationship they have with themselves. This relationship is built in ordinary moments, in the way you speak to yourself after making a mistake, in the way you respond when your body asks for rest, in the promises you keep or quietly break. No audience ever sees these moments, yet they shape a person's life more than almost anything else. Imagine spending years living with someone who constantly interrupts you, dismisses your opinions, questions every decision you make, never celebrates your progress, and expects perfection every single day. Most people would call that relationship exhausting, yet many unknowingly become that person to themselves. The harshest voice they hear is often their own, not because they enjoy criticizing themselves, but because they have repeated those thoughts for so many years that they no longer recognize them as criticism. They simply call it being realistic. But there is a difference between honesty and cruelty. Honesty helps us grow. Cruelty only convinces us that growth will never be enough. Healing often begins when a person learns to tell those two voices apart. For years, they may have believed that being hard on themselves was the reason they kept improving, but eventually they discover something unexpected. A tree does not grow because someone shouts at it. It grows because it receives what it needs: sunlight, water, time. Human beings are remarkably similar. Discipline matters, responsibility matters, honesty matters, but none of them require self-hatred. In fact, lasting growth rarely grows from constant punishment. It grows from consistent care. There is another misconception about self-respect. Many people imagine that it arrives all at once, as confidence, as certainty, as fearlessness. But more often, self-respect arrives quietly. It appears every time you listen to your own exhaustion instead of ignoring it. Every time you keep a promise you made to yourself, every time you stop apologizing for having normal human needs. No applause follows these moments. No one congratulates you. Yet these invisible decisions slowly rebuild something that may have been neglected for years. Trust, not trust in other people, trust in yourself. The quiet confidence that if life becomes difficult again, you will not be the first person to abandon yourself. Perhaps that is what inner peace has always been. Not a life without conflict, not a life without disappointment, but a life in which, no matter what happens outside, there is at least one place where you are no longer at war: your own heart. And maybe that is the safest place any human being can ever learn to call home. There comes a quiet turning point in many lives, not marked by celebration, not announced by the world. Often no one notices it except the person experiencing it. It is the moment they grow tired, not of loving others, but of constantly performing in order to deserve love. For years, their life may have felt like a stage, every conversation carefully measured, every opinion carefully softened, every disagreement carefully avoided, not because they lacked honesty, but because honesty always seemed to carry a risk: the risk of disappointing someone, the risk of being misunderstood, the risk of no longer being accepted. So they learned to read every room before speaking, to anticipate reactions before expressing themselves, to become whoever seemed easiest to love. It was exhausting, though they rarely admitted it, because when a role has been played long enough, it no longer feels like acting. It simply feels like life. Yet something remarkable happens when a person begins letting go of that performance. At first, almost nothing changes. The world continues moving. Morning still arrives. People still go to work. The sky remains the same. But inside, everything feels different. For the first time in years, they answer a question honestly without immediately wondering whether the answer was acceptable. They express a preference without apologizing for having one. They disagree without feeling responsible for everyone else's emotional reaction. These moments appear ordinary, but they are not. They are the first signs of a life becoming authentic. Authenticity is often misunderstood. Many imagine it means saying whatever comes to mind, ignoring other people's feelings, refusing compromise. But authenticity has never required cruelty.
It simply asks for alignment, a quiet harmony between what you believe, what you feel, and how you choose to live. When those three begin moving together, something unexpected happens. Life becomes lighter, not because responsibilities disappear, but because pretending does. There is a particular kind of exhaustion that comes only from acting, from constantly editing yourself, constantly calculating, constantly wondering which version of yourself will be accepted today. The mind was never designed to carry that weight forever. Imagine holding a smile every waking hour. Even the happiest smile would eventually become painful, not because smiling is bad, but because anything held without rest becomes a burden. The same is true of every identity we force ourselves to maintain. Eventually, the mask grows heavier than the face beneath it. Perhaps this is why authenticity often feels less like becoming someone new and more like finally setting something down. Not ambition, not kindness, not responsibility, only the unnecessary weight of pretending to be everything for everyone. There is a quiet confidence that begins growing here. It is not loud. It does not seek attention. It does not need to prove itself. It simply knows that peace is easier to protect than approval is to chase. And maybe that is what freedom has always looked like. Not having everyone agree with you, not being admired by everyone you meet, but waking up each morning without feeling the need to negotiate your identity before the day has even begun. Because a life spent performing may earn applause, but only a life honestly lived can ever bring peace.
There is a moment in almost every meaningful life when something begins to fall away. A friendship becomes distant. A familiar routine comes to an end. A dream quietly changes shape. Or a version of yourself that once felt necessary no longer fits. At first, these moments often feel like loss. The human mind naturally clings to what is familiar, even when what is familiar has been causing pain. There is comfort in habit. There is certainty in repetition. Even suffering, when repeated long enough, can begin to feel strangely safe. That is why letting go is rarely painful, because we are losing something valuable. More often, it is painful because we are leaving behind something predictable. The unknown asks more from us than the familiar ever does. It asks for trust. It asks for patience. It asks us to keep walking before we can clearly see where the path is leading. That uncertainty can feel frightening. Imagine holding a handful of sand. The tighter you squeeze, the faster it slips through your fingers. Not because the sand is trying to escape, but because force cannot hold what was never meant to be controlled. Life often behaves the same way. The harder we try to force certain people to stay, to preserve every chapter, to remain the person we used to be, the more exhausted we become. Some seasons are beautiful precisely because they end. Autumn would lose its meaning if every leaf refused to fall. Spring would never arrive if winter held on forever. Nature has never confused change with failure. Only human beings struggle to believe that endings can also be acts of kindness. Not every goodbye is a punishment. Some are invitations, invitations to grow, to breathe differently, to discover parts of ourselves that could never emerge inside the life we refuse to leave. Perhaps this explains why so many people look back years later and quietly whisper, "I'm grateful that happened," even when at the time they begged life to make it stop. Perspective is one of life's gentlest teachers. It rarely arrives while we are suffering. It usually waits until enough time has passed for us to see the pattern instead of only the pain. The river never argues with the rocks in its path. It simply continues flowing. Not because the rocks are unimportant, but because the river understands that movement is what allows it to remain alive. Perhaps human beings are meant to learn the same lesson. Not every chapter needs to be rewritten. Not every relationship needs to be repaired. Not every version of ourselves needs to be rescued. Some things honor our lives by teaching us, others honor our lives by leaving, and wisdom is quietly learning the difference. Because growth is not measured only by what we gain. Sometimes it is measured by what we finally find the courage to release. There is a question that most people spend their entire lives avoiding, not because it is difficult to answer, but because answering it requires letting go of almost everything they have spent years protecting. Who are you when there is nothing left to prove? Not when people admire you, not when they praise your generosity, not when they depend on you, not when your achievements speak for you, but in the ordinary silence where no one is watching. It is a strange thing. Human beings often spend decades building an image, without realizing they are quietly becoming imprisoned by it. The image of being strong, the image of being successful, the image of always being kind, always understanding, always available. At first, these identities feel meaningful. They give life direction. They create belonging. But over time, something subtle begins to happen. Instead of serving the person, the identity begins demanding service from them. The person no longer chooses the role. The role begins choosing the person. Like an actor who performs the same character for so many years that one day he no longer remembers how his own voice sounds. This is one of the quiet tragedies of unconscious living. Not that people become someone else, but that they slowly forget who they were before the performance began. Children rarely struggle with this. A child laughs because something is funny, cries because something hurts, becomes curious without worrying whether curiosity looks intelligent. But somewhere along the way, many adults begin replacing authenticity with approval. Little by little, they stop asking, "What feels true?" and begin asking, "What will be accepted?" It happens so gradually that they hardly notice it, until one day they wake up feeling strangely disconnected from the very life they worked so hard to build. Perhaps this is why so many people describe success as unexpectedly empty, not because success lacks value, but because achievement can never answer a question of identity. You can spend years climbing a mountain only to discover that the person who reached the summit is still searching for themselves. No accomplishment can introduce you to someone you have been avoiding. Only silence can. Only honesty can. Only the willingness to sit quietly without needing to become anyone else. There is a certain freedom that arrives when a person finally realizes they are allowed to exist without constantly earning the right to exist. That realization changes everything. Conversations become simpler, relationships become clearer, decisions become quieter, life itself becomes less of a performance and more of a presence. Perhaps wisdom has never meant collecting more answers. Perhaps wisdom is remembering the parts of yourself that existed long before the world told you who you should become. Because beneath every expectation, every title, every achievement, and every role, there has always been someone quietly waiting, not to become extraordinary, only to become real. And sometimes that is the bravest thing a human being will ever do. Perhaps the greatest transformation in life does not happen when the world finally begins to see you differently. Perhaps it happens when you no longer need it to. There is a quiet courage that receives very little attention. It does not make headlines. It is rarely celebrated. No audience applauds it, yet it changes a person's life more deeply than almost any achievement. It is the courage to stop negotiating with your own soul, to stop asking, "What must I become so that others will stay?" and begin asking, "What kind of life allows me to stay with myself?" These two questions may sound similar, but they lead to completely different lives. One is built on constant adjustment, the other on quiet integrity. Integrity is often misunderstood. Many people imagine it means always being strong, always being certain, always making the right decision. But true integrity has never demanded perfection. It asks only one thing: that your outer life slowly becomes an honest reflection of your inner one. This does not happen overnight. A river does not carve a canyon in a single afternoon. It shapes stone through thousands of quiet returns. Human character is formed in much the same way, not by dramatic moments, but by ordinary decisions repeated when no one is watching. Every time you choose honesty over performance, every time you choose peace over unnecessary approval, every time you choose to respect your limits instead of betraying them, you are becoming someone, not someone new, someone closer to who you have always been. Perhaps this is why the wisest people often appear so ordinary. They are no longer trying to impress the room. They are simply present within it, like an old tree that no longer competes with the trees around it. It does not grow to prove its worth.
It grows because growing is simply its nature. There is something deeply peaceful about a person who no longer measures their value through comparison, who no longer rushes to explain themselves, who no longer feels responsible for carrying every expectation placed upon them. Such people do not become perfect. They become free. Free to love without losing themselves. Free to give without emptying themselves. Free to rest without feeling guilty. Free to change without apologizing for becoming wiser. And perhaps when all is said and done, that is what a meaningful life has quietly been asking of us from the very beginning. Not to become the most admired person in the room, not to become the most successful, not even the most needed, but simply to become someone who can look back at the life they lived and recognize the person who lived it. Because in the end, the greatest victory is not that the world finally understands you, it is that after all the years spent searching, changing, struggling, and becoming, you finally understand yourself. And when that day comes, you may discover that peace was never waiting at the end of the journey. It was quietly walking beside you the moment you stopped walking away from yourself.
Perhaps after everything we have explored together, the real question was never how to become a different person. Perhaps the real question was always this: what parts of yourself have been quietly waiting? Beneath all the expectations, all the fear, and all the years spent trying to become who everyone else needed you to be? Life has a curious way of convincing us that we must constantly add something. More success, more approval, more achievement, more certainty. Yet some of the deepest transformations do not come from adding anything at all. They come from removing the fear of disappointing everyone, removing the belief that your worth must be earned every single day, removing the habit of abandoning yourself whenever acceptance feels uncertain. Little by little, what remains is not someone new, it is someone who has been there all along, waiting patiently, like the sky hidden behind heavy clouds. The sky does not disappear when storms arrive. It simply waits until the clouds move on. Perhaps the human spirit is much the same. No amount of criticism can erase it. No rejection can permanently diminish it. No mistake can take away its capacity to begin again. The journey toward yourself was never a straight road. There will still be days when old habits return. Days when fear speaks louder than wisdom. Days when saying yes feels easier than speaking the truth. That does not mean you are moving backward. A river does not stop being a river simply because it meets another stone. Growth is rarely measured by never falling. It is measured by how gently you learn to return to yourself. Again, and again, and again. Perhaps this is what maturity quietly looks like. Not becoming fearless, but no longer allowing fear to decide the direction of your life. Not becoming perfect, but becoming honest enough to recognize when you have wandered away, and compassionate enough to find your way back, one quiet step at a time. When the years have passed, people may remember what you accomplished. They may remember what you created. Some may even remember the words you spoke. But none of those things will matter as much as one simple question. Did you truly live as yourself? Or did you spend your life becoming someone you hoped the world would approve of? Only you can answer that. And perhaps that answer is the most important conversation you will ever have. Not with the world, not with your family, not with your friends, but with the one person who has walked beside you through every joy, every disappointment, every beginning, and every ending. Yourself. So wherever life takes you next, protect your peace, guard your honesty, be kind but not at the cost of your soul, love deeply but never disappear inside that love. Grow patiently, but do not rush to become someone else. Because the life you have been searching for may not exist somewhere far ahead. It may begin the quiet moment you finally decide to stop searching for permission to be who you have always been.